Hello, I will be lecturing on Reading 25, Our Drugs Are Better Than Yours, Schools and Their Hypocrisy Regarding Drug Use by Laura Finley, published in 2007. And this is really kind of looking at schools and also parents, but mostly schools' response, comparing kind of cannabis to medication prescription, specifically kind of looking at Adderall and Ritalin. All right, so it's on to the next slide. Why is this not working? Sorry, give me ones. What the heck? Sorry, give me a second. All right, so overview. This really talks about, like I said, the contradictory drug policies in schools, specifically looking at, cannabis versus the prescription patterns of Adderall and Ritalin, specifically, how these are influenced by parents, physicians, and educators, really playing a role in the prescription and recommendations for children receiving these prescriptions here. And what, this research in this article looks at is, the punishment. There's been a difference when we look at punishments for, compared to prescription drugs versus the zero tolerance punishments for marijuana. Often schools have zero tolerance for marijuana, but, they'll have punishments for prescription drugs, but oftentimes they're not as strict, or like I said, zero policy or zero tolerance like there is for cannabis. So the article kind of talks about this contradiction based on this kind of good versus bad dichotomy in terms of, drugs and the message that it's sending to children regarding these topics here. All right, moving on. So, they talk about how, schools have always been involved in intervening in social problems, and, preparing the youth for the future here. So one of the things, they talk about drugs, but you can think about, unwanted pregnancies, sex education, these different things that have taken place in school. So in another way they've been asked to intervene is, the war on drugs. And the example of this would be, drug testing students, asking students to tip off school officials to users, and special programs like DARE that take place in schools. The high school I went to, they, told kids to tip off the school if somebody, had drugs on campus. I actually had a friend who had weed in his locker in PE. Someone must have saw it and, went and told the school, and they searched him, they found it, and he was actually expelled for that semester here. Looking at this, they talk about, there's so much attention paid on cannabis, but there's a tremendous increase in use and abuse of prescription drugs. And, there's more attention now, but still, that's not nearly the focus of anti-drug efforts. I like really doing this lecture in person because I get a lot of feedback from students who, recently out of high school, but maybe think back on, your drug education, your drug programs that you were exposed to in school. What did they emphasize? Or, punishment, these different things. But, it's interesting to get your kind of perspective on, or, what happened for you in high school. I know, they really, for me, I had the DARE program. It was all about, cannabis being a gateway to other drugs. If you smoke weed, you're going to end up on heroin. But ultimately these programs do address a lot of different illicit drugs and issues that they may face, but we see that cannabis receives the bulk of the attention here. So moving on. Similarities. So one of the things they talk about in these similarities is the easy access here. A lot of teens use cannabis because of easy access. They report, that it's easier to obtain than beer or cigarettes oftentimes. But what we see is Adderall and Ritalin are also very easy to obtain. Doctors are quick to diagnose for depression based off of a checklist of behaviors. These evaluations may be as short as 15 minutes. We've kind of talked about this in another reading here. But, they say that, this kind of quick diagnosis has almost created this Ritalin mills for how easy and frequent they're prescribed here. They also talk about how easy it is to purchase from other classmates, friends, borrow them, take them from families, medicine cabinets. And now, there's, with the internet becoming so much more of a common place to obtain drugs or prescription drugs or drugs in general, that's another, avenue they address to the ease of obtaining these drugs. All right, moving on. So similarities continued here. We're kind of looking at why teens use drugs here. They say some, both for THC and Ritalin, but, to alleviate stress and pain, they provide some statistics, or, 30% had used, cannabis or alcohol after a depressive episode. They say it could have to do with being cool at, using it at parties or, in social situations or dealing with social anxieties. They cite boredom, as a use for why some kids would use, some type of drug to alter their consciousness, and they talk about, also, the influence of parents, children of parents who use cannabis, see there's has little risk, and oftentimes the parents have that. I'm sure a lot of us can think of, kids who actually smoked with their parents in high school. But, parents have a big encouragement, through their first introduction to drugs. Oftentimes witnessing what your parents do, whether that be smoking cannabis or, using medications here, but children are, almost encouraged or introduced, through parents and their use. All right, moving on. So we see similarities, attitudes about drugs here. They say, they see these drugs as not a big deal, cannabis or Adderall and Ritalin. They say many students use this Ritalin, Adderall like other stimulants, caffeine and Red Bull. We've talked about this in prior readings, but they see these pills as cleaner, safer, and not as dangerous or as illegal because they're prescribed by a doctor. And, seen as a normal way to want to escape life. It's almost understood. And, they say it's easier. It doesn't have the smell of cannabis. So, or, it's much easier to kind of hide from your parents. They talk about the similarities, these attitudes about drugs here. They also talk about, how these anti-drug programs like DARE are ineffective here. Maybe some of you had the DARE program. It's not really common anymore. I was exposed to it, but they say, teens, DARE oftentimes really, touted cannabis as this danger drug. Use it, it's going to gateway. You're going to turn into a stoner that does nothing and end up on heroin. But then these teens, these students who get this education and have friends, who aren't pothead losers, who are getting good grades, doing well in school. So they really don't believe, this DARE program. Why would they believe it when through their firsthand experience, they see that that's not the case. So these scare tactics do not work. The kids aren't dumb. They can make their own observations. Yeah, there are some pothead losers, but there's a lot of people who smoke weed, who are doing just fine. Another thing they talk about is, these programs alienate teens who need help, creating, almost if you smoke cannabis, you're going to turn into this pothead loser, stay away from kids who use cannabis, but if that was the issue and all these things, then they obviously need help if they're having these issues. And shouldn't we be trying to help them instead of alienate them? And ultimately it just really reduces credibility on the topics of drugs because, they receive this information from these programs, teachers, parents, and then when they observe something different, they're just, the credibility goes out the window. And on the other side, students continue to use, even though they are informed of the effects, sleepless nights, chills, racing heart, weight loss, specifically when you're talking about Adderall and Ritalin, because the payoff is greater. If you remember in some of the previous articles too, really talk about, the expectations, the stress to do well in school and all these things. So, when you think every decision, every grade is related to your future, your income, the payoff seems to be greater, and is understood why, maybe they would continue to use that when, these are the perceptions that they're fed that they have. All right, so moving on here, talking about the drug culture here, ultimately in the United States, we are a drug culture. We medicate for virtually everything and anything. Since 1990, prescription sales have been up 400%. They say half of Americans take some type of prescription. So they talk about, this, our drug culture and, our US society here. They say, a lot of different facts that they provide in here, but they say 1 in 6 people takes 3 or more drugs per day. US produces and uses 90% of Ritalin. But oftentimes that's not really discussed with children by their parents here. And they kind of cite some stuff, but one of the things, survey by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, more than 1 in 10 parents have had a discussion with their kids about drugs. But also on top of this drug culture, witnessing, seeing it everywhere around, parents using, in the United States, it's just incredibly common. But on top of that, get at different things. They even talk about, in video games, drugs are prevalent and widely used. They reference a video game called Narc, where you're like, you basically, mess with drug dealers and then sample their products. So, they just talk about how, the ubiquitousness of drugs in our US culture here. So moving on and kind of looking at, some of these differences, they talk about the drugs effect. I'm going to go over this briefly. We've talked about this in the previous article. These are high powered stimulants, Schedule 2, significant chance it'll be abused here, and then you see hyperactivity, impulsivity, and attention viewed as evidence of needs for higher dose. So oftentimes, if you've known somebody, there's often, cited needing a higher dose if, it's not working, when maybe there might be other issues. I do want to point out, these are articles that are, pointing out some of these, but in no way am I saying, that people don't benefit and, need these drugs. But this is something to think about here. There is possible long-term effects, the cognitive intellectual processes, but one of the things they talk about is common is a zombie-like behavior. You have this narrow thinking or focus, but it almost creates this zombie-like behavior, enthusiasm for almost nothing. And what we see is oftentimes, the drug is not being used as designed, it is being abused, almost as a performance enhancing drug. A lot of times we've seen in, some of the studies that they've done, students use it when they're, for school, it's a performance enhancing. They talk about, in school here, are these drugs encouraged in school here? We see the common reasons kids are prescribed is because they're struggling in school. We see, like we've talked about a lot, the pressures of succeeding in school and leading to your future, so parents may push children to use medication, to achieve greater success here. And it might not even be intentionally, but just by putting the pressure, you got to get good grades so you can get into a college and get a good job, all these different things that really creates a lot of stress and pressure that, they might not realize, but are pushing students towards, using Adderall or Ritalin here. One of the things that's been, documented through a lot of different surveys and research is, the abuse of prescription drugs in highly competitive private schools. In previous in-person classes, I've had several students who've gone to really highly competitive private high schools and just talked about how prevalent it was, how common it was. It was just understood. It wasn't even frowned upon. It was basically just like almost accepted here. And ultimately, depending on where you come from, your upbringing, oftentimes, being anything above average is a concern, so ultimately, this ADD, Adderall, Ritalin, these things that are for treating ADD, ADHD, oftentimes, can almost be a form of performance enhancement for, the students that are taking this. All right, continuing on here, they talk about, well, like I said, underperformance as a disorder, are they treating a disorder or are they just providing a performance enhancement? And once again, I said this in the previous articles we've talked about on, talking about Adderall and Ritalin. This is a very complex subject issue, it's not that there's just a clear path, and one of the, trying to diagnose it really gets at the point of how complex it is because, there's not a total agreement on that here. But what they say is oftentimes, if there's some type of quirk in this student's personality, that might be, cause for them to get a prescription. They say they tell kids to say no to drugs, but yet, there's doctors that are telling them prescribing these prescriptions that's going to say it's going to help them make them feel better. Another thing they talk about, parents are often misinformed or informed. Oftentimes when they ask parents don't even realize that, Adderall and Ritalin are stimulants closely related to methamphetamines and are considered amphetamine here, but this creates, they talk about this good parent, bad parent, but oftentimes parents, from the messages received from doctors, teachers, but especially doctors, that it's almost like, if they think their kid might have ADD or ADHD, they need to medicate them. If they don't, this is criminal, but you can understand as a parent where, the diagnosis for ADD and ADHD aren't crystal clear. That's really creates, an awkward, stressful situation for what a parent should do here. Ultimately, it's not a big surprise. Educators want compliant, well-behaved students. Talk about this a little later, but it's not crazy to think that students might not pay attention for 8 hours sitting in a classroom. That's oftentimes not highly stimulating here. But there's a lot of different factors, doctors, parents, but teachers play, are a major role in, recommendations here. The article says, 50% of diagnosis initially made by teachers, basically, teachers have been told they're the front line in diagnosing students here. One of the other studies said 85% of educators attended a workshop on ADHD, but ultimately, there's oftentimes this message sent to to teachers that, they should be looking out for this, and they can't prescribe or diagnose, but they can make recommendations to parents. Hey, I think you might want to have your kid go see a doctor. They might have ADD or ADHD. So there, very complex issue here. But once again, obviously educators want students to be well behaved and focused and attentive. But ultimately, not every teacher is amazing. It's kind of understanding, that for 8 hours out of a day, 7, 8 hours out of a day, you don't just sit there completely attentive to, what the teachers are talking about. But all right, so moving on, we see that these prescription drugs are treated differently in schools, compared to the horrors of becoming a pothead, nowhere near has the message of the dangers of prescription drugs, specifically Adderall and Ritalin, compared to what the fears they create around cannabis here. And kind of the responses to students using these prescription drugs illicitly versus using, cannabis illicitly. We'll talk about this just in a few here. But, the kind of difference in the response and the punishment here. All right, yeah, 1 second. I gotta pause this real quick. All right, so drug testing. Oh, sorry, that's blocking that. But ultimately schools are trying to deter and address, the use of illicit drugs, cannabis, all the different drugs here. But it's kind of what I talked about a little bit earlier, but they're ineffective for a lot of different reasons. Oftentimes, it's alienating the students that the school set out to help, they're drug testing for illicit drugs. If the student's using this, they have an issue, but then, oftentimes it's being expelled or punished. It's not providing some type of help, and ultimately just alienates the student. oftentimes, when there is drug testing in the schools, it can produce false positives. Oftentimes they're using cheap tests. People have figured out ways to cheat the test. We talked about that in the drug testing article. And, invade students' privacy. They often have to disclose information on what medication they're taking before testing, which can be mortifying. I mean, think of, the social awkwardness of being, a teenager and then disclosing the medications you're on, and we see, I think, oftentimes we're kind of understood that athletes, might be drug tested for steroids here, and these urine testings. But, ultimately what we see is looking at these different things here, rarely are they ever testing. They're not testing and looking into if these students are abusing drugs or have any issues. It's just literally, do you have this in your system here, And what we see is oftentimes schools punish students if they test positive, not allowed to participate in sports, suspension. Like I said, my friend was expelled from school here. But, when we're normally doing this in person, I asked the class how many people have been tested in school. Not a lot, but I've had a decent amount of students who are athletes who said they've been tested in school here, But ultimately, I think the thing I really like to emphasize is all this is saying is that a kid, consumes some type of drug. It doesn't deal with the issue of abuse. And oftentimes we look at rates of, use of cannabis, in high school. It's pretty common, this is not something that, is a signifier for a lot of issues. But, if you get drug tested and it comes up, you could be, punished, suspended, expelled, all these different things here. All right, so moving on. One of the things they talk about is this Not My Kid program here. This was basically created by an investor who invested in a drug testing company, but this is a drug prevention program founded in Arizona, expanded over in 24 new cities with programs for seventh graders. And what they passed out free drug test kits to parents. It tests for 12 different drugs, including prescription pills, but not going to spend too much time on that. But, initially, this is somebody who's invested in, a company that would benefit from this here, giving these out free to parents, and there's a lot of issues when we're talking about parents drug testing their children, what does that mean? The implications, how that might affect the relationship. So to just be giving those out to parents, I would think we could all have our different views on it, but ultimately, I don't think unless you're well informed on it either, you should just be giving drug tests out to parents. But all right, so moving on here. One of the things they talk about strip searches here, a lot of people assume it's illegal to strip search students. But what they say is, when we're talking about searching for illicit drugs, this is seen as constitutional. Rarely is that the case for prescription drugs. This is for illegal, illicit drugs here. But one of the big issues here is students that are more likely to be searched. They found special education, minorities. I've been trying to find this old video I watched. Vice had a special, I think it was like 30 minutes, looking into, special education students that were targeted for drug searches. And I believe it was Florida to kind of almost bolster their, but their rates of, finding drugs in schools. And we see that minorities are searched more. But when we look at research, it shows that white students are the ones that are using drugs at higher rates. So kind of interesting to see that difference there. We see white students are more likely to use and abuse prescription drugs, yet they're less likely to get searched. They talk about strip searches at this Philadelphia example. They said there's 13% success for drugs, 50% success for weapons. I think that's just a small little sample, but they provide that evidence there. But one of the things they talk about is, if a student is strip searched, this is damaging emotionally. And they say there's evidence that students suffer from PTSD, depressed, moody, or rebellious following these strip searches. All right. Wow. That's awkward. Sorry, I'll move that. But I'll read it out loud anyway. Sorry. But we see responses to ADD drugs in schools. Typically schools do not allow students to carry their prescription drugs on them. Oftentimes they will say, they have to hold them for them and then they can go and get the drug. And the article talks about hospitals locking up their Ritalin like any other drug, but they said school officials and parents oftentimes tend to look the other way and don't enforce that much. Yeah, they'll say, okay, the office or the nurse has to give it out, but especially when we start to see with teens in high school, oftentimes it's really not enforced that much. They talk about these responses to ADD drugs in schools, but they talk about the punishment being different. They provide an example of a student who admitted to using, selling, and distributing Ritalin in Dallas, Texas. But the punishment was only a 3-day suspension and some summer school. I always ask students if they know anybody who had got caught with, Adderall or Ritalin, non-prescribed for them on school, but no students have ever actually had any examples of that, which just kind of gets, kind of emphasizes what we're talking about here. But, this 3-day suspension versus, the zero tolerance expelling policy for students caught with illegal drugs. What we see, like I said, my friend was expelled for getting caught with cannabis. It wasn't like he was selling it. He didn't have some massive amount of it, but that's what happened. But what we see is oftentimes unequal punishment is really observed in relation to, cannabis versus Adderall and Ritalin here. So in conclusion, this really just talks about students are sent mixed messages about these drugs. There's drugs that are good and there's bad. And they really don't focus on the chemical compound, how they're used and abused, long-term effects, but the article, I do like the way they finish this article off, but they say it's unnatural to ask children to sit still for 7 straight hours. This isn't college where, you're choosing to do it. These students have to do this, but it's not a big surprise, that they may not be focused for 7 straight hours. Students may wish to escape the mundane routine, so they stimulate themselves with drug use, and ultimately they talk about how highly stimulating our world is now. People are getting constant stimulation from their cell phones, TVs. This isn't the 50s and 60s when things were moved a lot slower, so they're used to high stimulation here. But they finished the article off with this idea of teacher deficit disorder, TDD. This is obviously comical, but they say New York pediatrician Daniel Zener says, if the students are fidgeting, not paying attention, they're daydreaming, they're not completing their week or their work, teachers should be diagnosed with TDD and be medicated with amphetamine or other drugs, thus speeding them up and making themselves more dynamic and interesting to their students. So that's the conclusion of this. Obviously that's kind of humorous and an extreme example, but when you kind of step back and think about the implication, the messages that are being sent to, students regarding education and these different things and putting all the emphasis on them, although this is humorous, there is, a little bit of truth to it, where, they put a lot of emphasis on teachers diagnosing this, but, maybe not, it's not that crazy to think that students aren't, stimulated for 7 hours in a classroom. But all right, I'm going to end this now. Yeah, that's the end of the slide. Oh, and here, these are optional videos if you want to look at these kind of related to this, but they will not be on the exam, but feel free to check these out. And yeah, that's that.